Hey guys, and welcome to our first video where we're going to be making a pure CSS image of a koala. Now let's go ahead and first discuss what are the tools that we're going to need to go along with this video. So first, I have given a link to an article which I wrote, which I'm going to be walking through, which has pieces of code which we'll need to make this together. You're also going to need to go to codepen.io and create an account if you don't have one already. You're going to set up a new pen. And if you haven't done this before, you'll have to go to Change View and click on this editor layout. And now you will have a similar look as what I have, and we'll put our HTML together and then our CSS together, and then on our right side of the screen we're going to see our image as we go ahead and code it along. So the next thing I want to mention is that you're also going to have to use Chrome, and that is because Chrome supports clip paths which are not supported with Firefox, and we're going to need to use that to create our triangles, which may sound like a setback, but it's not a huge issue since we're going to do pure CSS to just get a lot of good practice. The other site I have is a tool called Clippy, and Clippy is going to be used to get our triangles, those clip path values which I just mentioned, and we'll get to that all later. But for now, just go ahead and have CodePen set up and make sure you have the article so you can go ahead and grab the code to code along as I do. Alright, so now that we've got that aside, let's go ahead and start with describing what is our pure CSS image of a koala, meaning what shapes do we have to create to make this. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create an invisible box. So this invisible box is going to be a container for our koala, and you can see it highlighted with white. And the reason you're going to need this outside container is because the position and sizing of all these different shapes are going to be percentage based. So instead of being percentage based for the entire web page, which could be all sorts of different sizes, we'll just have to control the size of our box. And by doing percentages, they're always going to be relative to our box and not to our entire screen. So we don't have to worry about different screen sizes causing issues where we're going to have a whole different look of a koala and distorted sizes and all sorts of issues like that. So that's going to be the visible box. That's going to make a little bit more sense when we surely describe our HTML. But for our actual shape of our koala, first we'll need a light gray circle to be our face or head. We're also going to need two circles, one light gray circle and one dark gray circle to form one ear. And there's going to be obviously ear for the left and for the right. Our eyes are going to be very similar to this. We're going to have an outer eye that's going to be white. We're going to have an inner eye that's going to be black. And we're going to put those circles together to form a left eye and a right eye. Our nose is just going to be a simple rounded rectangle. It's going to be given a brown color. And lastly, we will have our two pieces of hair, which are just going to be gray triangles. So hopefully you can see through describing all these different shapes that making this koala and just pure CSS images in general does not have to be really complex. We can create simple shapes, put those shapes together, and create a really cool final image. So with that aside, let's get started with our HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this from the original article. And I'm going to paste it here in our HTML in our CodePen project. Now I can drag this down and let's take a look at our HTML. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different classes and there's nothing else. And we don't see anything because obviously we haven't styled our classes. So we haven't used CSS to create the shapes. We've just declared the shapes that we want to create. And we're going to have all of the shapes which we mentioned here in our HTML. Now, why is this important that there's certain classes which are nested under other classes? For instance, everything is under our class of box. Now, this brings me to the point which I mentioned with the invisible box. With nesting in HTML, if a class is nested, its position and size, if used with percentages, is going to be relative to its parent. So for instance, our head, as we can see here, is going to be relative directly to its parent, which is box, which is the container, like I mentioned. So when we give a height, a width, and a position percentage for our head, it's going to be relative to box and not to our entire screen. Now, there's some points where we want to nest things under head. For instance, we can nest our ear left under our head. And the reason we need to do this is because it just makes things easier. So instead of positioning our ears relative to this box, we can position it according to the head, which will make things easier. So that is how nesting works with HTML, and that's why it's important with pure CSS images. So basically you have to break down the shapes and then think about what shapes want to be nested under other shapes. So for instance, it makes more sense to have our ears nested underneath our head, and it makes sense to have our pupil nested underneath our eye left. So you have to think these things through, but let's take what we have and go forward. All right, so with our HTML out of the way, let's go ahead and make our first class. So first we're just going to assign this body, and this is just going to give us this blue background color that we want. So I paste it in here, and now I see it's updated in our CodePen project, which is pretty cool. So let's go ahead and do our first actual shape, which is going to be our box. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the final code and break it down. So let me paste this in, and here we have a class for box. So we can't see anything, and that's because it doesn't have a background, so it's totally invisible. However, let me give it a border so we can see this as we code along, and then we'll change it at the end. So here I've given a border to our container, and now we can see it. So we position it relative and do margin auto and display block, which is going to center it. Then we just want to drop it down a little bit from the top of the screen, so we do margin top 8%. We give it a fixed width with pixels. That's going to be 600 pixels, and we give it a height of 420 pixels, and we do a background of none. Again, I added this border, but if we removed it, we will have our invisible box. But it might be easier to leave our border as we go ahead and create this koala. So there's our box. Now let's go look at our head. So we want to position this absolute. So we want to be positioning it with percentages. So we do position absolute. And then by guesstimating, you can go ahead and get the width and the height of 50% and 67%. We then gave it a background color of this, which is going to be our light gray color. Now the border radius is what I call the transformation code. And this brings up an important point. By default, when you're making a shape in CSS, it's going to be a rectangle of some sort. You know, if we made this a bit thinner, it would be more like a thin rectangle. And if we do a width of 50%, it looks more like a square. But no matter what, it's always going to be some sort of rectangle. So in each shape, there's going to be some sort of transformation code, unless you actually want a rectangle or you want a square. So the transformation code in our example is going to be border radius 50%. So what is border radius? That means how much are we going to curve out our edges. So that is going to be equivalent to the vector graphic tool, and I had a square and I curved out the edges. If I curved them 50%, so as much as I can, it's going to make it into a circle. So going to our CSS, if we do border radius 50%, it's going to transform this into a circle. So with that aside, let's describe how we got these top and left percentages. So this is positioning our top and our left, and we have specific percentages. And so let's take a look. Our head is a child of box, so therefore this positioning, as well as our width and our height, was based around percentages relative to our box. So how do we get 16.5% and left at 25%? Well, if we want something dead centered, like we want this head dead centered in between our container, then there's a really easy formula. So to get the dead center formula, like I like to call it, for our top we do 100 minus our height. So we do 100 minus 67 divided by 2, which gives us 16.5%. We can then do 100 minus our width. So 100 minus 50% is 50% divided by 2 gives us a left of 25%. And that's how you can center things with CSS. Okay, so we got our head out of the way. Let's go ahead and do the next thing. And this is going to be our head copy. Now this one, I admit, is the most confusing, and I don't want to spend a lot of time describing it. So basically why we need a head copy is because it is needed for layering. So here we're going to have an ear left and we're going to have an ear right. And if we go and look at our final image, as you can see here, we want these ears to be behind our head. Well, it simply wouldn't work unless we had a copy of our head. Now there's going to be a video later in this course that's going to describe how to control layering with ZIndex in a way that I could go into more detail than this video. However, I don't want you to dwell on this too much. Just remember that this is going to be needed so we can have our ears behind our head. So this is called a copy of head, and it's nested underneath head. So that means its percentages for its size and position is going to be relative to head. So we want an exact copy, so we do a width 100%, the height of 100%. We do position absolute like before. We give it the same background color. We do border radius 50% to make it a circle. And then here we introduce ZIndex. So what ZIndex is, again, I mentioned I have another video which is going to describe this in more detail. But ZIndex ultimately like layers in a graphic design tool such as Affinity Designer like I have in front of me. So let me take this nose for example. I can send this nose to be the bottom layer, so it's going to be below everything else. Or I could send it to be the top layer, where it's going to be above everything else. Now let's say I drop this nose down below our hair right and our hair left. Now it's going to be on top of everything else because it's highest on the list. But if we go below our hair left and hair right, it's going beneath it, and that's because it is, in terms of its layer number, it's behind hair right and hair left. So with CSS, this is how ZIndex works. So we start with the lowest number. So if we want to do our background, which is the bottom layer, we would do ZIndex of 1. And if we want to have a higher layer, we could go ZIndex of 2, ZIndex of 3, and so forth. And so that's how you use ZIndex. But let's go back to our koala. So we wanted our ears to be behind our head. So the ZIndex is going to be set to 2. So meaning this head copy is going to be above our ears, which will later give a ZIndex of 1, making it lower on the layer list and therefore behind our head. So that is how you use ZIndex. And again, I have another video later which is going to describe this in better detail. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go on and move forward. So the next thing we need to do is we need to do our ears. So let me just copy ear left for now. So I'm going to paste in ear left, and let's take a look. Here, as we can see, we have position absolute again, and we get a width and a height of percentage based, and that's going to be relative to its parent. And its parent for ear left is going to be our head. So we get our width and height relative to our head. We also position it. So we want it just a little bit from the top, so we do top of 5%. And here we introduced a negative left percentage. So why do we use a negative? Well, let's say we had a left of 0. Not sticking out like we want it. So if we do a negative, it's going to go in the opposite direction from our head. So if we did a left of 20, it would move this ear left 20% this way. However, if we wanted to stick out, and this is its value at 0, we need to give it a negative percentage so it starts to stick out this way. So if we do left of negative 20%, we get our ear left to stick out. Now, with something that's going to be the same, just reflected on a different side, like our ear right, we can go ahead and just copy this, paste it, rename it to ear right, which we defined in our HTML, and all we have to do is change it from a left of -20% to a right of -20%. So with the actual top and our right percentage, or in our ear left case, our top percentage and our left of percentage, I usually get this by just messing around and doing trial and error. Alternatively, you could use the dead center formula, which we did before, and you could center the circle and then adjust it from there. Either case, it will work. And we also gave it a background of this gray color. We did our transformation to make it a circle, and we did ZIndex of 1, so now it's going to be behind our head copy, which we can't really see, but let me change our color really quick. And you see now the ears are actually behind our head like we want. And again, this is going to be controlled with ZIndex. So this is looking good. So the next thing we'll do, oops, went too far. Let me adjust this really quick. So the next thing we'll do is let's go ahead and copy our inner ear class. So the inner ear is going to be that darker circle we want stacked right on top of our ear left and ear right. So if we paste this in, we notice that this now is being applied to both ears, but we just have one class. We don't have inner ear left and we don't have inner ear right. So let's take a look. So in both our ear left and our ear right, we have our inner ear nested underneath it. So that means its size and its position is going to be relative to both ear left and ear right, depending on where it's placed. So here it's nested underneath the ear left, so it's going to be relative to this. Here it's nested under ear right, so it's going to be relative to this. So why we only need one class is because the height and the width of our ear left and our ear right are exactly the same. The only thing that changes with our ear left and ear right is they're on two different sizes of our head. However, since inner ear is going to be positioned not according to the head, but just according to this outer ear, ear left and ear right, we just need one class. And so in this class, we do, again, position absolutes. We do border radius 50% to make it a circle. We can guesstimate and get a width of 80% and height of 80%. And if we want to do a dead center, we just do 100 minus 80 divided by 2 for our height and our width, which will give us our top and our left of 10%. And we just gave it this darker gray color. So now our koala is starting to come together. So we're going to do next our eyes, which are going to be very, very similar to what we just did. So let me copy this eye left, and let me paste it in here. So here we have eye left, and I get a width and a height. And now this is going to be relative to our head. And so that's how we get those percentages. And then we do top and left relative to our head as well. Now this eye left, we don't want dead center. So I usually do trial and error to get the top and the left. However, you could do the dead center formula to center one and then adjust it from there. And that will give you your top and left. We do border radius of 50% because we want to round this out to a circle. And we do ZIndex of 3 because it's going to be above our head, which is ZIndex of 2, which is above our ears, which was a ZIndex of 1. So our eyes are then going to be a ZIndex of 3. So let me go ahead and copy this and paste it. And we want the same thing for our ear right, just the opposite side. So I can go ahead and just change this left percentage to right. And there we go, we have our eye left and our eye right. Now, just like our inner ear, we're going to have a pupil that doesn't need to have two different classes because it's going to be positioned in size relative to each outer eye, which is the same size, just positioned on different sides. So when we paste in this pupil, we get a pupil on each side. And if we looked at our HTML, we can see that our pupil is nested underneath our eye left and our eye right. So this is really starting to come together. So let's move on to our nose. So I'm going to copy our nose, I'm going to paste it in here, and this is going to be just slightly different from everything else. And instead of doing a circle, we want a rounded rectangle. So before we get to the transformation line, let's again recap. We got position absolute, our background, which is going to be a light brown color. We're going to have our width, our height, which honestly I probably just guesstimated. And then here our left and our top, you could probably just do dead center and then just drop it down a little bit. And it's ZIndex of 4 because we want it to be above our eyes, which were a ZIndex of 3. So we want it to be a higher layer. And now let's look at our transformation line. So border radius, we have 50 again, but this time it's not 50%, it's 50 pixels. So in a short rule of thumb, whenever you want to do a rounded rectangle, just to slightly round the edges of a rectangle, you do border radius with a value of a pixel instead of doing it by percentage. This is going to make it less sharp, and it works nicely like here for our nose where we just want to slightly round the edges. So this border radius 50 pixels, as you can see if I remove it, is what's rounding out this to be a rounded rectangle. All right, so everything's really going well. This is pretty much done. There's just one last thing we need to do. And the last thing is we need to get triangles. So I'm going to go ahead and copy our hair left, and I'll paste it in here. And I'm going to get rid of this code right here, which is the transformation code. All right, so using the similar tactics as before, we got position absolutes, we positioned it, gave it a size, and gave it our background color. So all of that makes sense. Now we want this to be a triangle. So we can't do border radius 50% to make it a circle. And we can't do border radius with pixels to just make it a rounded rectangle. We're going to need to do something different. So here's where we're going to use a clip path. Now fortunately, there's a tool that could get us shapes with clip paths that makes it really easy. So if you click the link in your description of this video, you can go over and open up this tool. So on our right hand, we have all these different shapes that we can get values for. For now, we just want a triangle. So I simply just need to hover over this code, copy it, and paste it in at the end here. And now it applies a transformation to make this a triangle. So that is very, very helpful. All right, so our hair right is going to be exactly the same thing. However, with our hair right, we're not doing exact opposite sides like our ear left and our ear right. I just want to push it over a little bit more. So instead of being a left of 30%, it's going to be a left of 48%, which is going to push it over more to the right. And there we see our koala image is complete. So as you can see, we're just creating shapes with CSS, and they're really basic shapes. And it really just is important to break down the image, and then you're going to just have to know different shapes that you're going to need, know how you're going to control your nesting, create the HTML, and then just simply go ahead and knock out all of the styling in your CSS. But for now, let's wrap up and simply remove this border. And our koala image is complete.